whenever I see the news, which is like, oh, we're going to have to cut this, it's like, well, why don't we just look at the other side of the coin? It's like, why don't we grow our way out of this? Why don't we make it attractive for the best, tech, AI entrepreneurs in the world to come to London, build companies here, bring the talent with them, because, good talent tends to follow good talent, right? And that's the piece, and focus on that side of the coin rather than always being like, oh, we're going to cut this and we're going to kind of like save our way out of this hole, right? Which I think is a really, really difficult thing to do.
Welcome to another LFG podcast episode. We're really excited today to have Max Buchan with us, a London-based founder with a background in finance and fintech, where his firm had 2 billion of assets under management before he's now turned his sights to cybersecurity. Max is leading Valerian, which builds digital infrastructure. Now, we'll dive into all of that and much more in the coming podcast episode, but firstly, just welcome, Max. Thank you so much for joining us. We're grateful you've taken up time of your busy schedule to join us today. It'd just be great to hear how you found out about LFG, what kind of drew you to it as a movement, and where do you hope its future lies?
Yeah, look, getting straight into it, I think I really respect everything you guys are doing. I think it's a fantastic initiative. I think I get a bit frustrated sometimes, the amount of negativity that you see toward the UK and a lot of whining. And there is obviously a lot of problems to solve, but they're not going to get solved unless good people do good stuff to fix the issue. I've been in kind of a unique situation in the sense that Valerian operates between the UK and the US. So I actually spend a huge amount of my time in America. I'm going back to Austin next month, for instance. However, I still am doubling down on the UK. I want this to remain my primary residence and really build sovereign solutions for the UK.
That's excellent. And thank you for the very warm words and nice words for us. No, it's great to hear. And we'll definitely dive into the stuff on like US comparisons, because I think you'd have amazing insight into that. But I'd just like to zoom back a little bit into where you started, because your start of your career is really interesting, right? You joined a startup company and then found yourselves at 18 months. It was then $50 million in assets. It was under its management.
Revenue. The assets were quite significant.
Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. Yeah, so even better, right? 50 million under in revenue. And that was all before you'd raised funds. So
yeah, it absolutely. Sorry to cut you off there, but it was fascinating. I worked for the founder and CEO of CoinShares, a guy called Ryan Radloff, who was just an amazing presence. He was a Division I American football player before doing this. And if you know anything about that, they are extremely talented and driven people. And he had come over to the UK to really start the first regulated derivatives business in crypto, which was an extremely complex thing to do, well, any time, let alone back then. This was like 2017. And that was really the goal. But yeah, so I was really early team there. It was kind of pre-everything, and it was a lot of fun. Obviously hadn't gone down the venture capital financing route like I have now. So it's kind of, in some ways, it was the antithesis to the current story. But it was fascinating. So yeah, as you rightly said, we grew so incredibly rapidly from kind of a few of us to kind of 18 months later, I think there were a couple hundred folks on the team. And then that ended up going public on the NASDAQ, the company. So it was a really interesting rodeo, if you will. And yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah, and that kind of story of raising and building such a large company without getting the kind of outside investment, was that just a quirk of the industry you're in, of a company you're in? Or is it so much is built around at the moment of if you don't get funding, you can't scale, you can't grow. How much do you think that's actually, there's roots, it's just a different game you have to play almost, or different focus? Yeah,
I mean, look, I came out of that journey thinking every business was going to be like that. I think only in hindsight do I see the kind of rarity of that opportunity and experience. We were in this kind of fundamentally quite unique position. The main company was actually in Stockholm that was providing derivatives. And so it was kind of like a freak of a few different bits. But it was a fascinating experience. And we partnered with a kind of PE type shop as well to get where we wanted to go. But again, it was that kind of radical product market fit of also being quite contrarian, because 2017 was not a time where people thought Bitcoin was a good idea writ large. And that's one thing that I've noted again and again in my career, is oftentimes you have to be quite contrarian on your belief system, because the reality is if everyone believed the same thing, the market would already be saturated, right? So part of that is fine. Obviously, you can't just be contrarian in everything. You have to have a few very strongly held beliefs that you think are right, that you want to take big bets on. And so that's what I've done a couple of times in my career now.
Why do you think specifically UK companies find it so hard to grow that kind of top line revenue?
So I think if we're comparative with the US, I think it's just the market size, right? It's easy to forget, but it's if we look geographically, well, the US is roughly the size of Europe. Like, very rule of thumb, is roughly the size of Europe. Texas, for instance, is bigger than France. That's a factoid that always amuses me. But I think that the reality of that is you then have one country that's essentially one regulatory environment, right? Whereas in Europe, we are split between so many nation states. So it's such a fractured market in the sense of, if you want to expand from the UK to France, if anyone's ever done that, they know that's a nightmare, or Germany or wherever. It's kind of like starting again. Whereas in the US, you start up in New York, it's very easy to scale to Chicago, right, and to other cities around. So I think that's a huge component. It's just the market sizing piece.
I'd be really interested because you obviously had it, maybe not to the same extent, but this kind of product market fit moment. And obviously you left that company and then you started Valerian. And building this company, there's always times you have to pivot, you have to adapt, right? When was a moment you've had of like, oh, we've got it, we've hit the product market fit? Do you feel like you've got that already? Is it a constantly iterative process and you're constantly pivoting? But when did you really feel like, yes, we've hit something here?
Yeah, it was probably more recently than someone might think, actually. And it goes back to the contrarian point where, so essentially the story was I left CoinShares when I was 24 to go and start Valerian, which is obviously what I'm doing now. And the reason I did that is CoinShares had offices, all over the place. We had, New York, London, Stockholm, Paris, Jersey, the old Jersey, not the new one, and very different jurisdictional climates, etc. And this problem that I became quite obsessed about was the idea of kind of data exfiltration between nation states. Like, how do you manage a fairly global company operating in such different jurisdictional climates? Fundamentally, I realized that's not going to be solved by an app, right? It's going to be an infrastructural issue. It's going to be a digital infrastructure problem. And this kind of married up with a more kind of macro geopolitical stance that I was taking, which is obviously I'd lived through, as we all do, I lived through Brexit, right? We've got the war for Ukraine. Frankly, Hong Kong seized 20 years earlier than anyone probably anticipated. And frankly, now we've got the impending fight for Taiwan. So you had this rush towards physical sovereignty. And my viewpoint was, look, digital sovereignty is going to be the next frontier after this. And to do that, I started building this company, Valerian. And essentially, very high level, what we do is build kind of essentially virtualized enclaves, which like kind of very secure Kubernetes clusters, which you can run different types of applications in for different reasons: public cloud, private, hybrid, on-prem, whatever that is, for kind of different use cases. But essentially, that was probably 2 orders of magnitude more difficult to build than I had anticipated when I left CoinShares. I thought, we're going to get this running in kind of 6 to 12 months. It's going to be great. It took us 3.5 years to build the underlying infra, right? And so once we had got that, and when it was robust enough that we were taking it into production, we were then able to really get going with use cases. And to give you an example, right now, one that we are seeing significant market pull is basically folks bringing pre-trained LLMs into Accra, which is our foundational infrastructure platform, and then basically, drawing on sensitive data that they then park in the kind of database of Accra. And so the LLM only pulls on that data store, and that's all in a very secure containerized environment, right? Which is built by us. So that use case, which we're seeing also, by the way, in enterprise and defensive, that kind of like palpable product market fit you can really feel. But look, it took a long time. It took a long time for us to build this quite complex and sophisticated infra to do that.
If I can go on to a bit you touched on there around kind of Hong Kong, Brexit, Taiwan is the next potential risk area. All of these geopolitical events and the kind of shift, as you say, around towards digital sovereignty. I'd be interested in your view of the US administration. We're obviously 8 months into the new administration. That's already had a big shift in terms of UK's and Europe's focus on defence. How did that feel from your side, like working in that kind of sector? Was it a good feeling? Was it a kind of feeling of, okay, there's an opportunity here?
Well, I think, look, whatever side of the fence you're on politically, I think either way, it's hard to argue that it's not an inflection point, right? This is the first time in as long as I've been alive, right, where suddenly the dependency on the US, especially when it comes to kind of NATO writ large, is we kind of really have to stand on our own 2 feet. There's less of a sure footing in terms of financial dependency, for instance, on the US when it comes to NATO budgets, etc. And it really has changed, obviously, other member states' attitudes towards the US. Frankly, it was also a contributing factor to why I'm in the UK, right? I also firmly believe that we have to build our own British sovereign solutions, especially when it comes to defense, especially when it comes to resiliency. And that's why, for me, like, yes, we have a US-based business. My co-founder COO lives in Wyoming, of all places, so he kind of runs the US side. But I'm very much back here to build this as a kind of UK-first topco, which is obviously what we're doing now.
So why is it so important to be built in the UK then? If you could explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it's... there are a few ways to kind of answer this question, and we could talk about the idea of reciprocity in the sense of, like, I'm not sure it would ever happen the other way around in terms of the US, like, depending on a third-party UK business for all of their
One day.
maybe we're doing our best. But I think the reliance, and it's really less about, like, who our allies and friends are, right? Because obviously we're all allies. It's more about just kind of like supply chain risk. It's all the kind of regulatory supply chain risk as well. And I think it just kind of makes sense to have our own homegrown solutions, which we can depend on, especially in a really changing geopolitical landscape, which we're now in. So for me, that's really the thesis of why we're building Valerian here.
And why don't you think it's been done in the past?
That is a really, really good question. And I think, I've thought about this a lot. I don't really know the answer. I think it's a multitude of things, which is, okay, so we'll go for kind of the most straightforward first, which is maybe lack of kind of private market capital, right? So, for instance, the US is the absolute global leader in risk capital, right? There's no challenge. Obviously, we're getting a lot better at that now. I think access to talent is the biggest one. And there, by the way, I'm not saying there aren't talented people in the UK. The problem is when a good way to think about it that I heard the other day is kind of per tier one founder, you need at least 5 tier one operators, right, to surround them. And that's the reality. You might get really good folks, but can you build like the nucleus of a team around a tier one founder? I don't think we have enough talent density for that on this small island. I think we're making progress, right?
Is that a training problem then, or?
In my view, it's an experience problem. I think we are very good in the UK academically, and theoretically we're really good. I don't think we have as much production experience as the US because we really don't have the kind of liquidity history that the US, right?
Well, where's our manufacturing base as well? I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
We had that experience, 100 years ago, but,
Yeah, I mean, that's true as well. And I think, we're starting to, build the first kind of, for instance, like fintech's seen some massive surge in the UK. So you have the kind of fintech mafia now doing new companies. But obviously, if you see the kind of amazing companies, not just kind of the Googles and Metas and stuff, but all the Databricks and Snowflakes and the kind of like era after era of new companies that provide new liquidity, that provide new talent training into production. This isn't kind of a thesis. This is very much like have experience productizing technologies and taking it to market. So I think that's a huge piece. And then the third component, just going back to your question, which I know we spoke about before the recording here, is also just about kind of the cultural attitude toward building companies. And I think that fundamentally is probably the biggest issue, and it's why we lose so many of our significant companies. I think the two that always come to mind is, what the kind of only $100+ billion company we've technically had in the kind of aisles around us is Stripe, right? But no one really thinks of that as being a British company, right? Because they moved so early. And then you have Arm, right, which I think was a real loss to the nation to lose something so kind of infrastructurally important in my view. So that's a really long answer to your question, but it was obviously an important one to get into.
And do you have any ideas how we would change that kind of cultural attitude towards kind of being a bit more ballsy and risk-taking? And
I don't really know what the kind of solution is for the kind of cultural piece writ large. I'm hoping it kind of just erodes away as time goes on and you build more and more success. And we appointed a chairman to Valerian last year who co-founded a business called Darktrace, which is probably historically one of the most successful British cybersecurity companies.
Yeah.
And so you do obviously have runaway successes. I think the frequency and the aptitude for those happening more often hopefully will become more apparent as I said, kind of as we have more liquidity and as have more experience. The Darktrace one is a really good example because we, for instance, have just hired our first kind of phenomenal engineer out of Darktrace who has so much great experience of building into production, because Darktrace did it right. So we're starting to see the next generation come through. It's just we're probably quite a bit behind right now.
And it's interesting with defense environment, because actually, like, arguably that liquidity should be coming, because a big client in the UK is the MOD, and they've just had a big pay packet increase, and they're projected to go up and up for till 2030 towards the increase on the defence budget. But there's a flip side to that, which is, have the MOD, have government been super effective at spending that money? Have they been super effective in terms of their procurement process? And as someone like interfacing and trying to sell in and trying to build this kind of infrastructure, what kind of your views on that? Do you think that's something we need to fundamentally change as well and make adjustments to?
Yeah, I think it's also easy to conflate like dollar spent, or I should probably say pound spent in this instance, right, toward like net new innovation or progress, right? Because the reality is, and obviously we've looked at the SDR a lot. We were lucky to have one of our investors serve on the strategic defense review. The reality is, it doesn't really matter what percent of GDP we put to defense. It could be 5, it could be 7, it could be 10%. The reality is, if we don't structurally change how we're allocating those pounds, it's not going to change anything, right? Because you can end up in a position where you just bloat more primes, and depending on your kind of audience's knowledge, obviously the defense primes traditionally have been the ones to mechanically cater toward the contracts that are coming out of the Ministry of Defence, right? But it makes it very, very difficult to rival incumbents as younger companies, right? Because there's so many regulatory hurdles, there's so many kind of operational hurdles to get through. However, on an optimistic standpoint, you do have change. I mean, you have great companies coming out, like one in Germany, for instance, Helsing, that's now doing great stuff here. And it's great to see that things are changing and we are making progress. But traditionally speaking, just kind of putting more resource toward kind of like the incumbents doesn't necessarily equate to kind of more innovation and progress.
And do you see that as like a uniquely UK issue, like how we've structured it? I think the defence budgets across, especially after the US administration's push, is going up. It's projected to go up about 40% for the next few years. People committed obviously to do a 5% target in 10 years' time. All of this stuff means a lot more money coming in. Do you see it as like the UK has uniquely got this kind of structural issue, or are some countries better, worse than us? Yeah,
look, it's interesting. I might, if you don't mind, take a step back and kind of talk how we were pulled into the defence space, because we weren't founded as a defence tech company in any manner. We were very much enterprise company, but we basically got approached by some folks in the government space, particularly in the US, to kind of see, can we scale this virtualized enclave technology, right, to essentially a much larger demographic than, for instance, a bank. And it was a really interesting kind of academic problem to solve on kind of how we were going to do that. But that's really how we got into it. The irony, and I often tell this story, is my co-founder and COO, Josh, we met a couple of years after I founded Valerian. But I was still very much kind of garage-based, like we were building this stuff, right, the infra piece. And Josh has spent 18 years serving in the US Special Forces, and he spent about 12 years at Palantir Technology. So he joined in 2011, I believe, left in 23 when we met, and kind of somehow managed to convince him to come to a British startup and leave being a managing director at Palantir. So that was a boon. But the irony is, I was like, gosh, we've got this really interesting opportunity. And he was actually quite against it, right? Because he spent so much time within the kind of military industrial complex, both in uniform and at Palantir. And so what was fascinating is I was like, no, I think that's really interesting. And obviously we did go down that path. But for us, it was more we were catering to the demand of the market, asking us to do something rather than going and banging on doors. Because frankly, starting from the beginning and trying to build a defense tech company where you're trying to work out what the end user needs, who's going to be the contracting mechanism. I mean, it would be so difficult, I think, to do. It was just that we had built an enterprise company. Now it's technically a dual purpose company because we have a technology that also has capabilities for the national security community. So we kind of came in it that way. So it's only really been less than a year that we've been in that space, but it's been fascinating to get to know it. And this piece about kind of UK defence spending. Obviously, I think it is following. Obviously, it's following the trends of like the current US administration. I believe they're going to spend over $1 trillion for defence next year. Right, for the first time, it's going over that number. And obviously with the, thinking we can depend slightly less in terms of other NATO member states on US commitment, right? We just kind of don't have any other option. I think for me, it comes back to how do we make the most progress we can? How do we get the most value for money? It's more kind of what I think about rather than the actual pounds in. And really good examples of that, I think, have always come from the US, right? They were the first, again, back to my contrarian point, when Palmer Luckey started Anduril, right? This was not a cool thing to do. He had to be extremely contrarian. And it was kind of a really dirty word, defense still at that space when Anduril got going. But the products they're coming out with, and they were the first, obviously, to really battle against the whole cost plus idea, right? That actually is not just going to take a delta on price. They're going to spend their own risk capital building superior products and then just compete on product. And I think that's such a refreshing ideology. And then obviously, over the last 20 years, Palantir's been building in the national security space as well. So you have the real kind of pedigree in the US of the kind of first foundation companies building. I think in the UK, we don't currently have that. So obviously that's kind of why I'm here. We're very much trying to build that. But yeah, it's really interesting to see the ecosystem becoming more enriched here.
What are the kind of struggles that you find with building that capability in the UK versus the US?
Well, I think the irony is we kind of didn't build it as much here. So we had obviously our teams here, but our first successes were all in the US. That's the big irony. Is I think
is that first successes as in clients, funding?
Yeah, exactly. Both? A bit of both, really. Yeah. So we very much client side. We raised a bit of venture capital funding in the UK, but we had done our kind of main strategic round. So our seed round in total was about $20 million, and the kind of strategics were led by a fund in Austin, Texas called Scout, and they've been absolutely fantastic, and they're obviously very embedded in the ecosystem around defense as well. And so some of our early customer wins were very US centric. And I think it was only that idea of kind of legitimization of working with the first few, which allowed me to come back to the UK and say,
we need case studies, right?
Absolutely.
You need to win other business.
For sure. But I know we had this conversation before this morning, but it's that whole thing of, I think, the UK's attitude to risk, despite me, I was born and raised in Canterbury. I was obviously grew up here and wanted to build a fully domiciled business here. But the reality is I still needed to go overseas to the US, prove capabilities, and then actually bring it back here to sell, which is a massive irony in the sense of I think it's just it's back to our culture in the UK of just being more risk averse.
It's also incredibly frustrating, right? Because the ingredients are right there, and anyone in the government watching this, if there is anyone, should be really appalled by that idea. They've got a founder here who has a product which is now a few years down the line, got customers, scaling, etc. And you wanted to build a company here, you wanted it to succeed here as it is now, but you had to go abroad to first get it off the ground. And that should be a real red flag of saying, our setup, our ecosystem is not strong enough to identify these companies. Yeah. And I guess there's the government arm, there's also the private sector arm, right? It's a failing from companies as well to properly spot that and invest in you. I think that's a kind of feeling across of we don't have this risk mentality, there's some more caution.
I was about to say, I'm wondering whether it's more about the kind of how much our corporates have to invest, and whether they actually have that capability to invest in you guys, not just necessarily they don't want to.
I wonder if it's because especially in the defense space, right, we don't tend to work with corporates per se, right? You're more, it's the end customer, whether it's whatever kind of community that would be. But I totally agree with you both about the kind of fundamental issue. I mean, I guess to plug looking for growth. I mean, that's kind of the point of this kind of the raison d'etre, right, for being here. I do look to take the kind of more optimistic view. I do feel it's changing. When I started the business in 2020, obviously we're going to COVID, and it was a tricky time anyway. But paradoxically, it is just it feels like there's more energy now going into this. I think people are so aware of the issue of just folks exfiltrating, specifically to the US, right, when we talk about this. I'm not talking about the whole kind of tax piece about people moving to Dubai. I'm talking specifically building technology companies, the risk of tier one founders and operators moving to the US, right? I actually think there's an interesting case to be made for kind of an arbitrage opportunity the other way. So how I look at this is the reason why we raise capital in the US and will continue to do so is raising US private capital in order to deploy back in the UK and Europe. I think is really powerful because you're getting access to knowledge base of, as we spoke about before, productionizing technology, but you're also getting access to kind of that risk capital to scale. But then deploying it here in Europe, I think that's a really interesting arbitrage that we think about a lot.
Yeah, and how? I mean, I guess taking this away to a kind of solution. Obviously, we have the cultural piece and change. But if there's a prime minister, right, he sees this frustration, he sees this concern over companies leaving. Maybe arbitrage actually, like that's a good optimistic angle on it. But if you're advising the prime minister, what would you say? Look, you want to reverse this problem. Here's something you could do, or here's a set of things you could do.
I think you just got to make the UK the best place in the world to build businesses. And I know that's such a grandiose thing to say, but that comes down to so many factors. It comes down to for instance, I'm not sure London right now is the place it was 15 years ago where everyone wanted to move to London, right? We have to have a place if you're an engineer in Austin, you actually want to move to London because
a lot of people can't afford to, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. And there are so many reasons.
We've got New York rents and
100%.
kind of, UK wages.
Yeah, exactly. And whether it's the prices, whether it's the crime, whatever it is, right? I think that's a huge piece. We have to attract the best talent. The other thing is making it kind of economically appealing, right? So from a tax perspective, how are you encouraging growth companies to stay here, right, and not just pick up shop? And because the reality is, and there's a lot of discourse around taxing assets and kind of where they are or whatever if they're physically located, but we're in a world now, especially technology companies, we can all just pick up our laptops, right, and move somewhere else. It's really easy to do. So just doubling down on making it really attractive for all the best technical talent to be here. And we do have we have such a head start in the sense Oxford and Cambridge are two of the best universities on the planet, right? They produce some of the best engineers in the world. So it makes it shouldn't be hugely difficult to kind of double down on that and just make it easier for, as I said, kind of venture capital to invest here in terms of scaling companies from a regulatory approach. I mean, it feels like it's very achievable. I think if it was really kind of front and center of mind, I think it is a doable thing to solve.
Yeah, and I think I would completely agree. And you can even see examples of it, right? When it has to happen, things are pushed. The AI now Security Institute, but then Safety Institute was a prime example of that. The government were like, we need to do something here. They set up this institute, and they really pushed the boundaries of government hiring practices to bring in the top talent. A bunch of people from the top labs, the US and other countries, were directly brought in. And before, if you were in a government department, no way. You couldn't have just officials from other countries, other nationalities and citizenships working in a government body. It was super difficult to ever get that through.
Yeah.
But they could bend it. So it's that kind of idea. I mean, one of the complaints we get from LFG, or not at LFG, but about the kind of stuff we talk about is, this stuff's very complex. It's very difficult to do. You're not really appreciating what you need to think about and consider. And it's but when stuff goes wrong, suddenly it's quite quick. Suddenly you can do stuff that you need to do. And is that a reasonable argument, or have we kind of got this embedded into us that no, things are complex and therefore they take 10 years to build a runway in Heathrow?
I think these things are so silly when I hear it's you won't understand. It's so complex. It's so ridiculous. It's is it? And I think it's I think the problem in terms of I want to just talk about this growth piece for a second because I find this interesting. So you remember obviously just before Christmas in the US, everyone was talking about Doge, right? And you're talking about one side of the coin, which is cutting spending, which most people got behind as a kind of in theory. There's a lot less discourse around Doge. Obviously, there's the Elon and Trump fallout and whatever, right? But there's also a lot less discourse about cutting spending because all of the discourse is about growth, specifically in the AI sector, right? And it's kind of obviously the deficit is so huge, especially in the US. But if they can outgrow the deficit, you can actually see a path to freedom, to economic freedom, fiscal freedom in that sense, right? And which is really interesting. And so whenever I see the news, which is we're going to have to cut this, it's well, why don't we just look at the other side of the coin? It's why don't we grow our way out of this? Why don't we make it attractive for the best, tech, AI entrepreneurs in the world to come to London, build companies here, bring the talent with them because, good talent tends to follow good talent, right? And that's the piece, and focus on that side of the coin rather than always being like, oh, we're going to cut this and we're going to kind of like save our way out of this hole, right? Which I think is a really, really difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I won't name the production, but there was a thing I saw recently which literally tried to outline like why has the government got such a tough problem in terms of its about time spending review, but also budget, and it touched on it like, you know, to sort the government's problem. Ultimately, it's a spending issue. There's not enough money for things they want to spend on, etc. Then there's a few things you can do. You can raise taxes, you could grow the economy, or you can reprioritize and cut things. And
what are you talking about? 0.1% growth, James.
Yeah. But it was that kind of cultural thing where the growth angle was just like there's a one line effectively. They said, growth is a solution, but it's very hard to do. And they moved on to spending the rest of the time on tax and spend.
Exactly, and it's kind of the inverted priority, which is so bizarre to me, right? It's like we're going to like nickel and dime ourselves. And don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating for like bloated spending in any way. I'm saying, yeah, that's great if we can do that. But the reality is, it's a much more powerful argument to be theorizing about how we're going to grow our way out of this, right? If you look at kind of the growth rate in the US right now, it's fairly unprecedented based on kind of maybe 12 months ago. And for me, that gives me kind of a lot more optimism about what's possible here. And it goes back to your point as well about like when folks are like, oh, it's so complex you wouldn't understand. It's like, well, look, even if we just follow some blueprints over in the US, I mean, someone's doing something right, in terms of like month on month growth. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of my view on the balance of equation there.
Yeah, if we could take it back slightly as well. I mean, you touched on it quite a bit earlier about this kind of digital sovereignty angle. And I'd be keen for you to kind of dive into that. What does that mean to you? It's instinctively an interesting concept, right? Because a lot of the arguments around like, oh, we can benefit from big companies like Microsoft, etc., in the US. I know you're not advocating to not have that benefit, but it's this kind of argument of we also need to house data. It becomes a frontier, as you talk about. Like it's a frontier we need defense around. We need to have security around. Can you kind of expand into what it means for you, and how do you see that working in a intertwined world where we're still got these level of interaction between allies, etc. We've still got multinational corporations which have this influence.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, it kind of it dovetails into the conversation we were having previously about growth as well, in the sense of like, if you look at kind of the problem holistically, especially when it comes to kind of like, as I said before, building kind of like digital sovereignty it's not about like not buying Google, not buying Microsoft at all, because obviously, and it's really important that we kind of have a collaborative effort. I think it's more, especially in this kind of AI revolution, right? Two of the main pillars that everyone's thinking about. One is data, right? So who has the best repository of data to feed into these LLMs? And I think keeping that sovereign, especially when we're coming to quite sensitive data, whether it's military defense, whether it's health data within the NHS, which at the moment obviously are mainly being plumbed into external third-party companies that are headquartered in another jurisdiction. I just think, for me, the idea back to reciprocity is I can't really imagine a world in which the US government would, I often joke, but like trust a company in kind of like Folkestone, Kent, to headquartered there to manage everything. Obviously, the other pillar is energy, and I haven't seen enough discourse about that here, which slightly worries me as well, right? Because the reality is we can talk about becoming kind of an AI superpower, which is great. We can talk about building the next $1 trillion tech company here and stuff. But I mean, those kind of fundamentally, there are so many facets to that. So yeah, I mean, there's a few kind of components to that, but that's really why I focus so much on the sovereign piece. It's like, it's not about not collaborating. It's not about kind of not using US companies. It's just for the more kind of critical infrastructure stuff in this country. I do think sovereignty really has its place.
Yeah. Just like you don't want to be dependent on other countries for your energy supply. It's similar in terms of like security for your data supply. You want to have that.
It should just be part of the resilience posture, right? Of any country is we should probably have some of this stuff sovereign, right? I mean, I feel like that's just kind of fairly obvious in a way.
And there's a nice economic argument to it as well, right?
Yeah, 100%.
It's going to be more expensive if we buy it from elsewhere,
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the cost element, but of course there's also the value that you're giving up in the sense of like, if you're going to, like, I don't know, take the NHS, right? If you're going to plumb sensitive NHS data into a third-party system, not in the company, you're actually accruing economic value in another company in another country, right? So you're actually, not only are you paying for it, but you're also losing economic value on the back end, right? Because you're giving up your data. So it's just so bizarre in a way. So I agree on the economic point both ways.
leading into AI, I'm glad you picked it up because it's a really interesting topic from a case of like, this is transformational technology.
Yep.
There's big opportunities in the space, whether you're talking about, AGI future stuff, or whether you're just talking about actually the sheer ability you can do to automate tasks and speed up workflows, etc. Hopefully increase productivity, which we desperately need in this country. Where do you see the UK's biggest opportunity in this space? Like, we're obviously there's a kind of constant feeling I feel from a number of people who are like, we need our own kind of frontier AI system. We need our own Brit GPT. Versus actually, no, we should be specializing. We should be focusing on things like cybersecurity. We should be building up capabilities in that. Versus, actually, we can't do anything because we've got not enough energy to keep the lights on in the house, let alone build the next frontier model.
That's the thing. I mean, I don't know. I feel like we're putting the cart before the horse. I'm just not sure. Like, the problem is we need to build a better model than everyone else, right? I mean, obviously, I don't think we should use DeepSeek for a bunch of critical stuff. But I mean, there are some great models in the world, right? Mainly built in the US. It comes down to where is the source of your data going to be, right, which you're going to train models on. And especially, we go back to the sovereignty point in the UK, especially when it's government-related data. I think that's really, really important. And then the other piece, obviously, is how are we going to power all of this, right? And we talked before, I believe the statistic is something like, I believe China is adding one United States worth of electricity to their grid every 18 months. Right,
Jesus.
the kind of, but that kind of compounding power, which is what that's one of the fundamental premises of AI, right? So I think less about model, and obviously I'm not kind of advocating against sure, I mean having our own kind of built LLMs or whatever, but I think for me we can run models that have already been built natively here as long as we have proprietary data and we have the energy to power it. I think that would make a lot of sense.
Do you have a sense that people who need to make those decisions are aware of that? Do you feel that there's a blind spot here? It's nice to say we should be a leader in AI, but actually being a leader in just building energy infrastructure is the thing you need to do.
What I would say is I think I am, generally speaking, I mean, I guess it slightly depends on the day of the week, but I mean, generally speaking, I'm kind of optimistic about some of the initiatives that are happening, around UK Gov, and Valerian's really fortunate to be included in a bunch of these. In the
which ones?
What's that, sorry?
Which ones?
Just, I mean, almost kind of don't want to go into this kind of publicly, but just some of the kind of, conversations that are happening in the right rooms with the right folks, with a bunch of, not just us, by the way, a bunch of companies that I also really respect, and I respect their views, and the fact that for the first time it does feel really collaborative in the sense that there's a real sense of urgency to kind of solve this problem. And I do think the right folks within UK Gov, and there are some great folks as well who really want to execute on this and make positive change. And they are also leaning on industry. It's not just let's get, a bunch of random people in Gov talking to each other. They're also leaning on the right folks in industry and the right companies, which gives me a lot of optimism if they are going to kind of take those recommendations.
Yeah, this is I always found in government as well. Your access to good people is huge in government, and I don't actually think they leverage it enough. But when they do leverage it, they leverage it quite well. There's it's quite a nice experience. I mean, I was never involved in a big public consultation or anything like that, but seeing it secondhand in terms of the government can reach out, and people will spend a lot of time giving very well thought thoughts, willing to give it a time, etc., to engage. But it seems to come back to this point again about from a tech space of delivering a product, in the government space, actually taking what that said and delivering it and pushing it forward.
Totally, yeah. And that execution angle is always the fear, right, as well. And I don't think anyone minds. And but I do, because sometimes you give up kind of half of your day to go and do a roundtable for something very relevant to this, normally AI related and stuff. It's just you hope that the stuff talked about is executed upon, right? Because otherwise, everyone's so busy and stuff. Otherwise, you spend more time kind of executing on your own initiatives internally in your company, right? But I also think it's really, really important to kind of give back in the sense of if we are going to win, it's going to be a collaborative effort. I think to that point that we made earlier, the kind of difference in the US is each of these companies are such monoliths in the sense of there's so much power and capital wrapped up. I think if we're going to close the chasm quickly in the UK, it's going to be much more collaborative, right? Because we just don't have the kind of size or scale per company to do that. So I think it's going to be more collaborative, that effort.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of dive into the UK-US comparison stuff, which I know we've talked a little bit around, but especially around the funding side. And in the UK, there's this kind of sense that it takes ages to break through, but once you do, then everyone wants to be a part of it, and you almost see the dams breaking, and suddenly your FOMO sits in, and everyone wants a piece. Is that your experience or your feeling of how the UK works?
Absolutely. I mean, I always tell the story of when I started the company here. I was lucky enough that obviously I worked for an American chap right in the first business, and a lot of our kind of early support was from folks based stateside. And so the analogy is that when I started the company in the UK, everyone in the UK told me the 20 reasons it was going to fail, right? It was, not that I asked them for that, but they just kind of told me why it would not work out. It was like, well, I think I'm going to try it anyway. Whereas in the US, everyone was like, who are the 5 people I can call that will help this? It was just kind of that momentum and the flywheel start spinning, which was just like, it was like night and day. The reality is that you then kind of get enough momentum in the UK that everyone kind of wants to jump on and say that they were, around really early and whatever. Although I think that the bizarre thing about the UK as well that I've seen so many times is there's also a little bit of tall poppy syndrome as well, where you kind of have this kind of happy middle ground whereby you kind of have enough momentum that like everyone's positive, but then also you see a lot of companies that become successful. People want to tear them down because it's almost like, oh, they're too successful, right? They the market cap's too big, and they kind of want to like cut them down to size, which is so bizarre. Because if you think like when you spend time in the US, it's like they really celebrate their wins, right? And I think that kind of like, that kind of cultural affirmation is also really like intoxicating as well. It wants you to continue to do more and more and stuff. But, I've had friends, and I won't name names, who've built kind of, multi-billion-dollar companies here, and then kind of everyone wants to hate on them for some reason. It's kind of like quite oppressive, and it's why a lot of folks I do think end up moving, because it's like, well, what is the point in doing this? You're creating thousands of jobs and all this stuff, right?
Have you got a kind of message for our listeners that would be interested in kind of getting past that, I guess, the hurdles that British society may present, not just in the cultural attitude, but also, how you kind of built it up, if that makes sense?
I think the resilience you need in the UK to start is actually such that once you get through it, it actually makes things a bit easier, right? Because then if you go and start building it in America, it kind of feels like a little bit easier, just in terms of like people's appetite to do stuff is just so much greater. So I would say people building here, I mean, it is, firstly, I empathize because it's really, really difficult at the beginning, and it does take a lot of resilience to just keep pushing until you get certain momentum. I think for me as well, getting folks, we had one fund in the UK that backed us really, really early called IQ Capital that are based in Cambridge. And they bet on us really, really early. And I do think having folks in your corner, again, especially when you're making contrarian bets, is so unbelievably important, because that leads to other folks being interested in stuff, and especially when it comes from a kind of fundraising perspective. And then also from a customer perspective, I think for me, like having great investors is always one of the most helpful thing for expanding kind of customer base, right? Because they're kind of a trusted entity. It lends legitimacy for the different stuff you're trying to do. So I would say kind of like just kind of keep pushing on the UK, because it kind of eventually starts to work in your favor.
Yeah, so the message is we play at hard mode. So
absolutely.
That's the consolation prize, is we're all just inadvertently playing on hard mode.
We are, yeah. And then but once you get through that, it's
the game gets super easy.
Exactly. Obviously where we are now.
You can go to America.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, I'm saying where we are now is easy, but it is a sense of like, it's just, I think just from an attitude perspective, it's just amazing, because I spent a lot of time in Austin, a lot of time in New York, etc. It's just like the kind of just willingness to like to move forward. It's just so it's so palpable, and it's just like, especially once you've had to like drag stuff kicking and screaming in the UK to get off the ground, then you go there and everyone wants to just like move toward growth. It's just so exciting. And I think for me, it's like the last piece I would mention on this is, I think it's why folks can be really tempted to sell out really early, because also back to kind of the market cap and the liquidity piece, right? When you see these quite, quote unquote small acquisitions, right, in the UK. Some American company will buy it and it'll say it's, 50, 100 million pounds or stuff, which sounds like a huge amount of money, right? But you've got to remember, for like US funds, I mean, that's tiny. They'll kind of write you off if it's that, because they're trying to invest in stuff that will become the next deca-billion-dollar company or more. And I just think that's... But the difficulty of doing that here, and also the fact that it's so attractive to do that so early on here for great British founders, I think for me, just to go full circle, I think having done one experience of a really hyper growth company that then went on to, obviously list on the it went on to IPO, etc. I think it was having been through that once, it kind of makes me want to go again, but even bigger, right? So how do we build a $10 billion company, but in the UK and British first? And I think without that formative experience in the first company, it would be quite hard to kind of like theorize about how we're going to do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting take on it. Something I spoke to a friend of mine about recently, and he had really interesting takes on it, really kind of good takes on the idea of, it feels like the energy you do have in the UK is people wanting to build the next unicorn, and they're like full sights around, I want to build the next big thing, but they haven't yet built something slightly smaller or had the experience of going like, well, actually I just want to solve like a problem I want to learn in this phase, and then build something of 10, 20, 30 million, sell, get your freedom, then go for the big one. Would you support that, or do you think
I definitely see a lot of like folks saying that they want to build unicorns, but the reality is, and then you see so many people sell out like really, really early on. So I feel like sometimes the narrative of we're going to build the next whatever.
It's ambition level, right?
Yeah, and then actually the first offer comes in, and then they grab it with both hands. I think for us, it's like. Just having kind of had the experience before, it's like, having seen what good looks like, we really, really want to do this. And it's not just me. It's obviously like, Josh went through that growth trajectory at Palantir. Obviously, Nick, our chairman, co-founded Darktrace, which was really successful here. So I think we've all kind of seen what good looks like. So now we're doubling down and making sure like Valerian really does get there, right? Because, we're kind of not interested in doing things kind of in halves, as it were.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to come onto your team. You mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but team is so critical, right, for a successful company. How is that experience of one, finding those people? Did you just happen upon one another and like, this seems like a good partnership? Like, how do you build that, and how do you kind of keep that as you're going to scale as well? Obviously, from experience you had before, as companies grow, it gets trickier, right, to make sure that you have a close team who share the vision, deliver on it, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I do almost think it's like the only thing that matters, right? I mean, people are the only thing, and that's whether it's people on your team, right? The folks supporting you, whether it's people that are backing you financially through investment. Frankly, whether it's the people within the customer organizations that you're interfacing with, right? The only thing that matters is interpersonal relationships in that way. But I think specifically on the team point. All I would say is like, look, the great folks attract great folks, right? So it's, again, back to the idea of getting the flywheel spinning. So once you get the first kind of, that's the really difficult part, is getting the first kind of real tier one operators next to you who then bring in, because it's not just kind of a legitimization aspect, it's also just like the trust of folks want to work with people that they trust from prior lives, etc. But it also comes back to, for me, it's why when we did our early rounds, it was important to get really amazing angel investors who had phenomenal reputation, because a lot of like our really key hires came from angel investors who had invested in us, knew me, and so would refer folks. And to give you this example, I have a friend, Will, who actually, well, he's technically not an angel because he set up a national security fund called MD1, and he had served in British Special Forces before then. And, I was in the Gulf, and at the time, Josh was managing director of Palantir Qatar, of all places. He had kind of led that business through the World Cup. So it was a really interesting time to be there. And we'll basically say, hey, can you just look after this kid or whatever? He's never been in this place. And so, Josh and I just met and obviously really, really hit it off. And then he came in. But, Will obviously knew him from prior life because they both served in similar units, obviously one in the UK, one in the US. So it's that kind of like trust piece, right, which is so important to really early kind of high quality tier one hires, I think.
Yeah, and this is what's left out of a lot of the debate about people leaving, or at least the debate I've seen of it. Obviously people saying, people are moving abroad, they're taking their companies with them. But there's also this kind of element of this is very talented people, not just in themselves, but with their network, and also the people they interact with, the companies and people they coach, etc. You have this trickle down.
Absolutely.
And if you lose that talent, you lose that entire influencing effect they have.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100%, and it's why. And I see it because obviously, like I've got some really, really close friends who are doing other stuff and building phenomenal companies and pretty much all of them are going to the US, which was really sad but you're absolutely right. It's not just a question of we don't just lose one fantastic founder doing something incredible. We lose their entire executive team. We probably lose a bunch of kind of satellite folks around the company. So yeah, I think the kind of network effect can work both ways. Obviously, network effect when you're building teams is really strong, but in terms of people exfiltration, the network effect of that can also be quite damaging as well. So I think that's why, again, back to this piece, the whole looking for growth piece, I do think it's why it's really important to if folks are investing in this space to kind of be cognizant of what the issues were and get good folks to try and solve them, right?
You should come hang out in the LFG community.
Well,
we got some great people that come along, and
sounds great. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on this one. It feels like
no, not at all.
You're in it now.
First step for it.
Next event, everyone will be like, I saw you on the podcast. Final question, if we may, around, we like to end on kind of two halves, which is one, something that makes you pessimistic, for lack of a better word, about the UK, where you feel like we're going down the wrong path and that this concerns you. And then flip and end on the optimistic angle of actually, where do you think our unique strengths are? Where do you think we can really hit it off, and where we should lean into if we're not enough already?
Yeah, I feel like as a kind of founder and a builder, I hate being pessimistic, but I think if I were to be, it's the stuff kind of aforementioned at the beginning of the podcast, right? It's kind of about there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to firstly, obviously, crime's been a real issue. And I say that from a place of I'm trying to get folks to move to the UK. And that frequently is brought up for a reason they don't want to be in London, right? Which is fascinating. I think the other piece as well is around kind of we've talked about cost cutting and cost saving, but the tax burden, I think, is also going to put a lot of folks off. I like to think about how do we encourage growth more than how do we tax more, for instance. But look, I do think those are both solvable. I think, speaking kind of more optimistically, I do think there's just a lot of great folks thinking about this problem, right? It's, obviously there are these kind of great initiatives, but also even within UK Gov, I've been fortunate enough to speak to some really phenomenal minds who are really keen on doing stuff. I don't think this is just a question of pontification and, kind of chin wagging. There are a lot of people now. I think it's kind of got to the stage, it's we really need to do something about it. And so what kind of really gives me optimism is if enough of these folks stay here and really, really want to move the needle, I do think it can be done. So, that's kind of my quiet optimism about the whole thing.
And that is great news to hear, especially if you're, Keir Starmer, who's recently said he's frustrated at the system.
Yeah.
There are these pockets in there, and from my experience with government as well, you have those, and if you can energise them, point in the right direction, give them the freedom to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely.
Completely agree with you. We can do it.
That's the key piece, right? The freedom to deliver, because I think too many folks feel like they're just battling against the system, and they're.
I like that phrase.
So battling against the system.
No, freedom to deliver.
Freedom to deliver.
Yeah, it's quite fun.
Yeah.
Could be a good name for a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we got a podcast name. It's 4 episodes in, we finally cracked it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Becca shot down all my other suggestions, so yeah.
That's a plus, mate. But thanks again for having me, guys. And also, I just think it's such a fantastic initiative, right? So I'm glad a lot of folks are getting behind it.
Thanks for coming on, Max.
Yeah,
it's been great.
Yeah. I mean, it's only great because we've got people such as yourself who's supporting and working with us. It's a pure movement built up off of people. So it's great to have you on. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Wish you and the company every success, and looking forward to see where you scale to next.
Cool. Thanks, man. Thanks,
Thank you so
guys.
much.